So welcome everybody to today's discussion on responsibility, hope, and strategy in times of crisis. This discussion is a part of a larger event series that has been organized by Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute, Duke Law's International Human Rights Clinic, Columbia Law School's Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, and Just Security. I work at the Human Rights Institute, and I'm the clinical teaching fellow at the Human Rights Clinic at Columbia, where I lead a project on advancing human rights and promoting long-term peace in Kashmir. As you all know, our speakers today are Kathryn Sikkink and César Rodríguez Garavito. Neither of these leading scholars and advocates can be described, and their work and contributions to the human rights field are hard to describe in one sentence, but I'm going to do that anyway, just so we can turn quickly to them. Kathryn is a professor of human rights policy at Harvard Kennedy School and works on international norms and institutions, transnational advocacy networks, and the impact of human rights law and policies and transnational justice. César is a visiting professor of clinical law at NYU, is the founder of Just Labs, is the director of Open Global Rights, and is an advocate and scholar in the areas of human rights, environmental rights, and indigenous rights. In today's discussion, Kathryn will discuss her new book, The Hidden Face of Rights Towards a Politics of Responsibility, in which she explains that in order to fully implement human rights and ensure that these rights are enjoyed, we need to move beyond the responsibility of just state actors and instead focus on the responsibility of all actors to take collective action to ensure that these rights are enjoyed. She'll also briefly discuss how her interests in rights and responsibilities came about and how this emerged from her research on the origins of international human rights law that places an emphasis both on rights and responsibilities. Based on lessons from his work, César will discuss the need to actively shape the narrative about the current context so that any story that emerges is one that is rooted in hope and solidarity as opposed to fear. He'll also talk about the need to complement on the ongoing dominant mode of action of the human rights field, which is to call out perpetrators of human rights abuses, with forward-looking actions and proposals that look ahead and anticipate what is needed when the current crisis subsides. And although this series and this particular talk are focused on the current pandemic, what Kathryn and César will be sharing today are incredibly relevant, not just to the current reality, but well beyond that. Their lessons today that they'll share will be just one more example of how their scholarship and advocacy has a profound impact on how the field should operate and should begin to innovate. In terms of the format for today's discussion, both Kathryn and César will speak for 10 minutes each before we move into Q&A. And if anyone wants to ask questions, even as they're speaking, feel free to tweet questions using the hashtag COVID-19 Justice or use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. So Kathryn, let's start with you and then move over to César.
Okay. Thank you. First, I really want to thank the organizers and the sponsors of this virtual event, especially Columbia University Law School and its Human Rights Institute. And I want to thank Gulika Reddy for serving as our moderator. And as ever, it is a pleasure for me to share a panel with César, who is a long-time collaborator and friend. So I also want to say one good thing about virtual events is that I'm joining you from my sabbatical in Uruguay, in South America, something that I wouldn't be able to do if this weren't a virtual event. So obviously we all know human rights issues are central to the coronavirus crisis. And so our individual and our collective rights to health, and in some cases, the right to life itself are at stake. But also our right to liberty, freedom of movement, education, information, food, and shelter are all at stake. And I think importantly, and I think we're really starting to find this now, is that people's rights to be free from discrimination are particularly in play. And it's already clear that COVID-19 places undue burdens on the poorest and the most vulnerable parts of the population. So, as Gulika said, I want to talk about my new book because many of the ideas in the book are really pertinent to the coronavirus situation. Even though, of course, I don't mention it all in the book, which was published in January, because it wasn't part of our life as I was doing the research and writing. The book, as Gulika said, is called The Hidden Face of Rights, Toward a Politics of Responsibility. It's published by Yale Press. And in it, actually, Gulika already gave such a good summary, I barely need to do it. But basically, this notion that to fully implement human rights, we need to place more emphasis on responsibility of all actors and not just states, to take action together to make sure rights are enjoyed. So first, let me clarify, because this is a group, I think, mainly of lawyers and law students. And so the first thing I have to say is my argument is not at all about new legal responsibilities of any actors. Okay, so this is an argument about the need for ethical and political responsibility. And in the book, I draw on work of political theorist Iris Marion Young, and in particular her book, Responsibility for Justice. And in it, Young argues that we need to take forward-looking responsibility. And so this is something that César and I will both be talking about today, because I think we've both been influenced by Iris Young's work. So what Young argues that forward-looking responsibility means that all actors that are socially connected to an injustice and able to act need to work together to address the injustice. So we can contrast forward-looking responsibility with backward-looking responsibility. The liability model, who's to blame, who can be sued or prosecuted criminally. Now, as you know, the liability model is the main legal model of responsibility. And I believe in the liability model for many human rights violations. I've written a whole book on criminal accountability for mass atrocity called The Justice Cascade. But many human rights issues are not well handled only or primarily through backward-looking responsibility. Now, I want to begin with an example because just today I published an op-ed I wrote with Carrie Booth Walling. We published in the Spanish edition of the New York Times. And it's about the failure of the UN Security Council to take responsibility for any action in this crisis. I don't know if you've noticed, but the UN Security Council has been, as the New York Times said the other day, missing in action. Okay, it has ignored its responsibility to take action in this crisis. And it's done so because the P5, the permanent 5 members, except France, are caught up with their parochial concerns. And both China and the US are thinking mainly about backward-looking responsibility. The Trump administration insists perversely on blaming China for the crisis. You know, the whole thing about this is the Chinese disease. And China, of course, wants to avoid such blames at all costs. And so as a result, the Security Council is deadlocked. But it's too late for the blame game. And so in this op-ed, we argue that the situation of great power deadlock needs to be broken by the 10 elected members of the council. And many of them are small countries, like the Dominican Republic is the current president of the Security Council, Estonia, but also Germany, South Africa. And these elected members need to step forward, take responsibility to step forward to support France. France has been the only great power that's tried to put forward a resolution, and they need to nudge the council towards forward-looking action. And we're suggesting this forward-looking action probably has to start with something as simple as a presidential statement, not a resolution. But a presidential statement could be the first step towards more action. And they need in particular to back up Secretary General Antonio Guterres for action. Guterres has already called for a global ceasefire, but the Security Council has been silent. They haven't backed him up. And they also need to back up the incredibly important work that WHO is doing on the pandemic. And so this is one way to think about responsibility of all actors, not just states, but also international organizations and states acting within international organizations, but also governments at other levels, state and municipal governments, who in the United States have been stepping forward in the absence of US federal government action. But also there's responsibility for NGOs, for universities, and even for individuals. So imagine, even if all governments were taking efficient action, and we know they're not, but if individuals also didn't do their share, staying home, washing their hands, no country would be able to bend the curve. And many, many individuals have stepped up to take responsibility, but others didn't, you know, as we saw with the crowded beaches of Florida during spring break, or the crowded streets of Mardi Gras in Louisiana. So governments, in this context, government needs to strike a balance between protecting our collective right to health, taking responsibility for protecting our collective right to health, and respecting some other human rights, like our right to movement, let's say. And so a quarantine is a legitimate and necessary state policy in times of health emergency. But the state still must attend to the rights of individuals caught in the quarantine, rights to adequate health care, to food, to shelter, etc. And no amount of emergency can justify some of the discrimination that we are beginning to see. So as my colleague at the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Harvard Kennedy School, Jackie Baba, has recently stressed that pandemics have a paradoxical impact. On the one hand, they don't discriminate between rich and poor nations and individuals. And in fact, Max Roser, who does a terrific website called Our World in Data. And if you don't follow him on Twitter yet, he's really worth following him on Twitter. Max Roser, Our World in Data. They've got the best data right now on COVID-19. But Roser has actually shown there's a strong correlation so far between the wealth of the country and the number of cases and deaths. And we have seen that some of the richest and most privileged people have also been affected. But what we're now starting to see is that inequality is playing a big role in people's ability to protect themselves. Their ability to self-quarantine, to access services such as quality health care. And the pattern of deaths within wealthy countries like the United States is revealing these patterns of inequality. And so the poorest, the most vulnerable people will bear the brunt of the crisis and deserve the greatest attention from governments, but also from other actors. And here we're talking about the homeless, the incarcerated, those who are confined to overcrowded nursing homes or refugee camps are at the most risk now and going forward. So in ordinary times, people sometimes like to talk mainly about their rights and less about their responsibilities to the community and duties to promote the rights of others. But this extraordinary situation that we live in reminds us that the rights of all are linked intrinsically to responsibilities to the broader community. So, you know, in some cases, our responsibilities are simple and they may not be onerous: to stay at home, to avoid unessential travel, to wash our hands, to cover our mouths, but also to be informed, not to panic, not to hoard essential items like hand sanitizer. But we also have responsibilities to support health workers or sanitation workers or the workers delivering food who don't have the luxury of staying at home. In other cases, there are people who are going way beyond these more straightforward responsibilities and really doing more to work collectively to help those who are most vulnerable. But I think we also have a responsibility to think about what comes next and what we need to do after the pandemic. And I believe that we have the potential to move the world in positive directions after the pandemic if we think seriously about the lessons we're learning. And you know, there's many lessons, and I know that César will be talking about this as well, but we're learning that we need more, not less, international cooperation and governance. We're learning that the tremendous inequalities in our society put way too many people at risk. But we are also learning that we, and here I'm going to say we privileged people, we're traveling too much in ways that were harmful to the environment, and that maybe we can return to a somewhat simpler way of life that would be better for our health and for our planet. So I just want to end with the idea that you know, I'm never talking about responsibilities instead of rights, but rather I'm talking about the importance of putting rights and responsibilities always together in a framework of thinking about action, how to move forward so that everyone can enjoy rights more fully. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was incredibly helpful. And I think what you said about how rights are connected to responsibility, and I think if people sort of take the idea that you've left them with, it may also help alleviate some of the fear or lack of control or sense of helplessness when, you know, the agency is put back into their hands. And I think what you said about responsibility now is important, but also we shouldn't be short. You know, I think we often see situations where people forget the lessons when you return to some sense of normalcy. So it's important to sort of be forward looking as well in this moment, and remember the lessons we learned now, a few months or years from now. And I think that's a good segue to what César is going to be speaking about, which is forward looking strategies at this time.
Thank you, Gulika, and thanks to the organizers of this event. It's always a pleasure for me too to be on a panel, in person, virtual, or in any format with Kathryn. As will become readily apparent, her work has deeply influenced my own scholarship and practice. So I'm very glad to be here with all of you. So some of you may have seen, read a very compelling article published by Indian novelist Arundhati Roy entitled "The Pandemic is a Portal." So I want to begin with a short quote from the last couple of paragraphs of that beautiful op-ed. Quote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world, and ready to fight for it." After reading that, anything I say will, unquote, will sound both not at all eloquent and relatively silly, but I'll do my best. It's a hard act to follow, and I set it up myself. But the key thing here is because the text is provoking quite a bit of debate. And some people read it as some that real saying, well, everything, this is a clean break with the past. Now the future is full of fresh possibilities. And I tend to be a glass half full type of person and practitioner and scholar. But I think we need to ask ourselves, without doing any futurology, what might happen? What could we anticipate might happen so that we can, as a movement, I'm going to be speaking of the human rights field or space or movement as a whole for now, for brevity's sake, once the pandemic has subsided. It will be around for a while, but it will pass. And the question is, how is it that we can anticipate what will happen so that we can shape it? And one can see a lot of crystal ball reading these days, right? The pessimists see actions like the ones being implemented by Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Netanyahu in Israel, and so on, as further entrenchment of already concerning trends of populist authoritarian leaders pushing back against human rights values and institutions. And so the pessimists have a point. But also you can read this in a more optimistic, through a more optimistic lens, and see that the impossible has already happened, right? So basic universal income was supposed to be impossible, unaffordable. Universal access to healthcare in the US was supposed to be no-go zone, and yet something approaching, or something that the seeds of that have already happened, even in a country like the US that's quite inimical to this solidarity-based measures, because, for example, testing, whenever that becomes available here in the US, will be administered for free. So it is true that governments and societies can afford to provide some basic goods and one thing that we do know, and this is what Arundhati Roy, I think, is putting on the table, is that we're at a critical juncture. And this is no longer a resource from literature, but from the social sciences. I'm very glad to see that sociology is coming back. We spent 30, 40 years thinking that societies are made up of individuals and there are no collectives, no collective patterns. My PhD is in sociology. I'm very glad to see how sociologists are being asked to rehash some old ideas like collective solidarity, like ideas for long-term trends. And one specific idea from historical sociology is that ideas matter at a time of crisis. Because people are disoriented, because people are hungry for new contents, because people are at a loss. So the usual paradigms of thought and action are shaken up. And this is a moment of opportunity also for human rights practice. Now, the usual or the dominant reaction, the instinctive reaction that at least I see in the human rights movement so far has everything to do with the kind of the backward-looking, liability-centered model of human rights, which, as Kathryn said, and I have written also, is absolutely essential to human rights work. It's made fundamental contributions to human accountability for human rights violations for many decades now. And that has certainly quickly translated into one after another initiative at tracking down abuses around the world. So there are a number of important portals, not of the Roy type, but of the platform type, a web platform type, that are tracking down the emergency measures being adopted by one government after another, and trying to figure out whether those will be, those are consistent or inconsistent with the human rights norms. So that calling out of abuses, that naming and shaming work is absolutely fundamental. But I want to argue that it is not enough. And this is one of the ideas that I've taken from colleagues like Thomas Coombs at Just Labs, and from Kathryn's own work. Previous book, the thing is that Kathryn publishes so fast and such good contents that now her great book is already not her latest book. So Evidence for Hope is the book that has influenced my thought about how to think proactively about human rights. And what that means is to stop being always on the defensive, to always be reactive, to always be kind of behind the curve of the developments and narratives that have been set by human rights violators, by the populist authoritarians of the world, by the architects of technological dystopias and surveillance capitalism. And that actually, this more proactive, more forward-looking, hopeful view jibes well with findings from surveys that show, for instance, that the members of Generation Z around the world are tired of being told what they cannot do. They want to know what they can do. And I think that feeling, that sentiment is cutting across different generations. We're being told to stay home. We're being told to not do one thing after another for good reasons. But then the question is, what can we do? And that entails, and this is where I want to put on the table just for discussion a few concrete proposals that some organizations are trying out around the world that might represent this hope-based, forward-looking approach to human rights, which, by the way, and I've written about how the human rights movement needs to learn more from other fields. One field that I think provides a lot of inspiration and very specific action ideas is journalism. Some of you may have heard about the Solutions Journalism Network, or the work of a great organization called the Constructive Institute. that basically have done the same for journalism that I'm proposing to do for human rights. Acknowledge that investigative journalism of the denunciation type of the uncovering of stories and shady deals is absolutely important, but that solutions and positive stories also have a place in journalism. So one way to see this is that this is a view that starts with a plan to it. So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who used to be the head rabbi of the UK, has a beautiful TED talk in which he says, well, optimism, I'm all for optimism, but optimism to me sounds a bit too wishy-washy, a bit too ambiguous. I like hope, and he defines hope as optimism with a plan. So because in the end, the future is what we do together. And this is, I'm gonna leave you with a couple of ideas for a plan. One has to do with narratives, and the other one has to do with human rights campaigns and actions. On the narrative side, I'm gonna simply quote from the work of colleagues Thomas Coombs and Sean Luna and Lucas Paulson and others at Jazz Labs. And also in a project that they have been doing with the Fund for Global Human Rights. And they're about to come out with a hope-based guide for of communications in the context of COVID. And they give 3 specific pieces of advice. First, let's avoid the word crisis. Right? Amartya Sen has written that while overcoming the pandemic might look like a war, what is really needed, rather than top-down decision-making, is participatory governance, public discussion, and alert listening by leadership. Different framing. Second, don't personalize, collectivize. Telling people not to go out to avoid harm is not as effective as telling people to stay home to help others for the common good. And this, I wanted just to show graphically this contrast by showing you, I'm gonna share my screen for a second here. The contrast between these 2 front pages, right? Same story, completely different framing. On the left, you see this, the storyline is many loved ones will die. Second one is together we can save many lives. So what I'm proposing, or what my colleagues are proposing, is that we use more of the language of the front page on the right. Together we can save many lives while acknowledging the grief and the pain and the inequality of the current moment. And finally, one action point, and this is something that human rights organizations can actually practice in their daily lives, in their now that they have to connect online, is just do an exercise in which you start with complete the sentences, the following sentences. In the future, blank. In the future, we want to do this. We want to accomplish this. Because in the end, and OGR, Open Global Rights byline is reimagining human rights. So in the future, if we want to anticipate and have a chance to shape the future, we need to imagine it right now. Finally, because my time is almost up, I'll give 2 just a flag, and I can be happy to elaborate on some of these ideas in the Q&A, but I'll just flag 2 very specific proposals because people are already mobilizing around some of these narratives and types of thinking and doing. And again, I'm gonna try to share here my screen to show you what an interesting collective of creative activists are doing to, can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, share here. So this is to me, it's a brilliant idea. The idea that they're campaigning for around the world virtually is to free the vaccine for COVID-19 when it becomes available. So not wait until in a year's time, in a couple of years' time, the same pharmaceutical companies, the same governments hoard the vaccines and apply the same intellectual property regime that has excluded so many millions of people from access to medicines. And we start to campaign, to have to campaign for that now. I'll hold on the other example and maybe insert it in the discussion so that we can move on to Q&A. Thanks.
Great, thanks, César. I think it's always really wonderful to speak with you, because I think people are often critical of the human rights field and the way it currently operates. But I think what's so wonderful about you and Kathryn is how clearly you articulate a possible way forward, and not just with ideas, but I think what was so great is how specific you were with examples and, you know, specific language and specific exercises that one can do as they're visioning a way forward, or reimagining a new reality. So thank you both so much. We're going to move to Q&A now, and as a reminder, people can either use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, or they can tweet questions using the hashtag COVID-19 Justice. Just to get us started with the Q&A with some questions that have already come in, Kathryn, you talked about the importance of rights and responsibility and how critical it is when we're thinking about the right to collective public health, and as well as the collective responsibility that plays out. Are there other rights that you can think of, or just other examples of rights that you can use, where you could share perhaps what our responsibilities might be?
So one of the issues that really, well, two big issues that got me thinking a lot about rights and responsibilities, and that are featured heavily in the book. And they're quite different. One of them is about climate change, right? And it became very clear to me that people wanted to start talking about climate change in terms of individual rights, or you know, even the rights of trees, the rights of rivers, the rights of Pachamama, the earth goddess, right? And I'm not at all opposed to talking about climate change in terms of rights, but I think it really doesn't get us far enough, and that we need to think about our collective responsibilities to work together. Everyone capable of taking action needs to work together in order to address the climate change threat. A second issue had to do with voting, and it really is one of those issues where, in order to enjoy your right to vote, right, you have to also take your responsibility to vote. And I was very shocked, because I was talking to Harvard undergraduates a couple of years ago before I was writing this book, and they were just convinced they had a right to vote and they had a right not to vote. And they really weren't thinking as much about their responsibilities to vote. And in the meantime, since I started that research, an amazing student movement has emerged where students are taking very seriously their responsibility to vote and the responsibility to help others to vote. And faculty members and administrators at universities are taking seriously their responsibility to help students vote. I mean, I'm a political scientist, and I promise you that in the past, political science faculty virtually never talked about the mechanics of voting in their classes. They just assumed that my students know how to vote. But right now, in the crisis we are facing in the United States, perhaps one of the most important responsibilities people have is going to be their responsibility to vote. And so that is another area where this rights and responsibilities framework is really important.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. I think for anyone who knows me, they know I enjoy nothing more than someone calling out well-intentioned people and pushing them to do a little bit more, or think a little bit more critically. And I think it's just so much easier to talk about rights than it is to talk about responsibilities. And it's so much easier to think about the very real external and systemic barriers to progress, and harder to kind of hold a mirror to yourself and to people within your field. So just thank you for that reminder. Another question that has come up is, you know, when we're thinking about forward-looking strategies or responsibilities, often groups have come together and assembled in the past in order to do some of these visioning exercises, or even if they've tried to advance rights, things like protest and organizing in person and marches are strategies that the human rights movement has often used. And that's just, those aren't options in this moment. So César or Kathryn, either of you, do you have any thoughts on how the field might think differently or leverage other kinds of spaces in this moment? And not just in this moment, but this is perhaps a time to reimagine new spaces that in some ways may become more inclusive because they don't rely on the physical space.
Yeah. César.
I was hoping you would go first with this one, but this is a hard and important question, Gulika, because one thing we know from political sociology, again, social movement studies, is that the power of the marginalized, it lies in numbers, in being able to mobilize together. And there is a reason why in countries like Chile, the Constitutional Assembly movement has lost steam because it was based on a very vibrant mobilization on the street. And now that cannot happen. So we cannot underestimate the impact that the lack of the possibility of direct collective action and the opportunistic use of the restrictions by some governments will have on human rights causes. But just as that is a threat, here comes the opportunity. For a while now, especially younger activists have mobilized quite effectively online. So the Fridays for Future movement, which continues to be one of the most inspiring stories recently in the social justice space for me, well, it happened as a combination of school strikes, and now all young people are on compulsory strike. They're staying home, but they continue to mobilize online, and they were able to disseminate this strategy of action on Twitter, on Facebook, on other online platforms, to the point that some scholars have called that connective action with a double N, as opposed to collective action with a double L, which is the type of mobilization of the masses of numbers that we're used to calling social movements. So I see this as a time also for generational succession and for younger collectives like the Creative Activism platform that I mentioned is pushing forward this campaign on freeing the vaccine. By the way, I'll share the link to their campaign on the chat in a moment. And that also creates an opportunity and a challenge for more well-established organizations. I think that many of those organizations are already rising to the challenge of learning how to connect with younger generations and combine the best of professional advocacy, connective action, and collective action.
Can I just say, because I really thought that Cesar's example of this Free the Vaccine campaign is so promising, and I'd want to hear more about what they are doing, but you can even start imagining a connective action campaign that working on freeing the vaccine, and it might be one that would involve, could have a role in universities, for example, where lots of research takes place. And sometimes research with federal government funding that then provides private goods to corporations, right? And so I think one could even think of like a pledging movement as scientists and researchers and others who are involved in basic research that has contributed to some of these possibilities for vaccines could just start, being asked to pledge and saying, we are committed to freeing this vaccine from day one. And start bringing pressure to bear.
Thank you both so much. So we have lots of questions that have come in from the audience. I'm going to start with one from Thomas Coombs, since he was referenced during the talk earlier. So he's sending in this question from Berlin. He's been struggling with how to use human rights to push the healthcare issue without simply making it an obligation for governments to fulfill an SDG, fulfill it in an SDG sort of context. And he wants to know, how can we change the debate around how we care for each other, whether this is refugees or sick people or other kinds of individuals and populations after COVID?
question.
Yeah, I think Thomas would be much better placed to answer his own question than I would, because he's really the expert at developing this type of narratives. And the action points that I quoted towards the end come from a document that he's preparing out of Jazz Labs and the Fund for Global Human Rights work on narratives. But from my background, I have done research and advocacy on access to medicines. And one of the things that struck me in working in that space is that the stakes are huge. The salience of the issue should be pretty obvious in that and bodies are at stake pretty much, and this is what this pandemic also brings home. It's about the basic constitution of human beings, like physical integrity and life in the end. And yet that domain that of policy making and activism, intellectual property and right to health have been dominated by quite esoteric narratives and legal frameworks. So it's really hard, and I co-published with Rochelle Dreyfus here at NYU a book on access to medicines. And one of the things that we realized in looking at norms around the world is that the efficacy of the pharmaceutical companies and global north countries in pushing for an IP, intellectual property agenda has been quite effective, much more effective than the efforts being made by great organizations around the world. My sense is that this is a way in which this pandemic might open up a possibility, because the salience of health as a basic need of all human beings will become more salient. Now the window of opportunity will be short. So that would be this is more of a call for action than a response, to use precisely the type of framing that Thomas has advocated for, focusing on future, focusing on opportunities, and focusing on the connection among all people who will need and are needing medical care now.
We have another question is from Arpita. So she asked, do you think that this moment also forces us to rethink our relationship with the state? A sort of renaissance of a welfare state, perhaps, with demands for universal healthcare and social security, amongst others.
So first, I believe that the way that the Great Depression marked my parents' generation, right? In their entire lives, they carried with them some memories that came out of the Great Depression that affected everything they did. And I'm thinking about the way that John Ruggie wrote about something he called embedded liberalism. So John Ruggie, a political IR scholar at Columbia and now at Harvard University. And he also wrote, there was this critical moment, the post-war critical moment, in which the decision went to build a kind of liberalism, but one that protected people's basic well-being. In other words, there was a compromise between international capitalism, but enough protection so that local needs were taken care of. And so I think that just the way the post-depression, post-World War II world was a critical juncture that led to different policies, that there's a possibility for, everyone who lived through this pandemic is going to be marked, I think, in a similar way to how the Depression marked my parents, okay? And now the question is, what is that marking going to mean? But I think it's exactly what the question was about, a new attitude about the state, and especially about the state and health, and obligations to address health, and awareness of how the deep inequality has such terrible health implications, right? We're seeing out of New York City, right, that the people, even the people who are the death rates, you can see it by area, and disproportionately Black and poor people are dying at a higher rate because of poor access to healthcare and because of pre-existing conditions, right? And so I do believe that that is one piece that will change, but it won't change by itself, right? It'll change as a result of connective and collective action, people making demands in order to bring about change.
Thank you, Kathryn. We have a question from Borislav Petronov, who works at the OSF Human Rights Program. And he said great ideas about how human rights activism can shift. The challenge probably is that the movement needs to change a lot in how it thinks, how it acts, and the skills it has, and the tools that it uses. What do you see as the three most important institutional or organizational changes it needs to do to focus on a vision of the future? And I just kind of wanted to add to this question to both of you. And Kathryn, you of course must be familiar with the adaptive leadership class at the Kennedy School. And when they discuss change in that class, they say people often don't resist change, they resist loss. So what are the losses or barriers that the human rights field both, and they've raised, he's raised institutional and organizational, but there are also individual barriers and potential or things that are viewed as losses. So what would you both say are these barriers, and how would you suggest that people reframe these losses or rethink how they navigate them?
Right. Well, so I'm just going to get started, and I think César can add, but it's a really good question to think about what is what's being lost. And when I talk about responsibilities, I do believe that the human rights movement reacts with some fear about loss, okay, and loss, understandable losses. There's a fear that if we start talking about responsibility, more actors, that will take the responsibility off the state, that will let the state off the hook, right? And that's a legitimate fear. And I think we have to say, no, there's ways that by asking everyone to step forward and take more responsibility, that part of the responsibility is to make sure we don't let the state off the hook, and we ask more of the state as we ourselves are doing more. There's also a fear about blaming the victim, right? That if you start talking too much about responsibility, that somehow there's going to be blaming the victim. And here I think we have to make an important answer there, and that's saying that as human rights activists, we believe in empowering people. We're empowering people. That's why victims often don't want to be called victims. They want to be called survivors, because by calling people victims, it takes away their agency, right? And so the strength of a rights and responsibility framework is that it involves empowering people to take action and not only see themselves as victims waiting for action from the state.
Yeah, just to add to that, a couple of ideas in response to the key question. One thing that I think will be important and actually will become more feasible is the nurturing of communities of practice that will operate online in ways that will bring people together, just like we're getting together here, but on a more sustained basis. So far, an organizational trait in many human rights institutions entails getting together in person, and that tends to reify and reinforce existing institutional structures, because there's only so much you can do in person, and that it tends to be costly, and it tends to lead to an over-representation of older generations in the movement. So there's a lot less opportunities for connection for younger activists than there are for more well-established activists and advocates. I've seen, and I participate in quite a few Zoom sessions these days that have brought together people who would have not otherwise gotten together. My hope and my aspiration, and this is something that we're working on here at the clinic at the New York University, and also other spaces like Open World Rights and Just Labs are working on facilitating conversations that are as effective as this one has been, as well moderated as this one has been, but that include unusual suspects. And unusual suspects mean actors coming from fields that would not, organizations or collectives that would not self-describe as human rights activists. Again, going back to the example that I've given, this is a collective, the one joined the Free the Vaccine campaign. It's mostly a collective of creative artists in collaboration, by the way, Kathryn, with a university-based network of students that Gulika Reddy and other now well-known scholars established to try to push universities to work on accessible models of medicine production. So that's that. In short, what I would want to see, I would propose that we try to do is to use this moment to promote better, more effective ways centered on skill development, on problem solving, and that will include actors, individuals, and organizations that would usually be excluded from the movement. There's a lot more, and there's a lot that need to be reformed. I agree with the premise of the question about the need for the human rights. Actually, I've written about the need for the human rights movement to have changed long ago. Now, with this disruption, I think it is unavoidable. So we either embrace the opportunity or we're left behind the opportunity of shaping what comes after the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. But Gulika, I'm curious, because I thought it was a great question. So how would you respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of losses comes up in any kind of challenge to how the human rights or critique of how the human rights currently operates. And I mean, I think the way I view it is similar to what you said, that if there are going to be other losses if we don't, which are much more severe in many ways, if we don't address these ones. So, I mean, even if we think about something like thinking about mental health or well-being or sustainable movements in the context of human rights work, I think often we worry about, you know, if we cut back on this, then we won't be able to achieve our project outcomes and goals. But if you don't do that, then you're just moving towards a field that's not joyful, not creative, not innovative. And there will be sort of other losses that come with not looking within, or with other kinds of critiques, you know, in terms of just say relationships between actors in the global north and south. People often use effectiveness arguments and say, oh, it takes too much time or too many resources to actually have equal transnational partnerships. But I think, yes, those are costs, but the other cost is that you're perpetuating the same harms and inequality that the field otherwise tries to address. And Kathryn, what you said about, you know, this fear of blaming the victim, I think I've often, when we do some of these visioning exercises in Kashmir with young students to say, what can education look like for informal and informal spaces in a post-conflict reality? You know, a lot of people focused on the what question, and we've been focusing a lot on the how, and you know, moving them beyond what is it that the state wants. And our Kashmiri partners themselves have said it's important for us to not be stuck in victim mode and to view ourselves as agents of change and stakeholders to this conflict, rather than people who have only been impacted by it. So I think victims, quote unquote, also agree with what you have said and view themselves as real agents of change in this process. We have several more questions. One is, what possible strategies can be fostered to improve international cooperation after this pandemic, given that closing borders and limiting travel may be the new norm for a while? And I'm just gonna add a second question since we're at the last 5 minutes. Someone asked, are there any suggestions for one action we should all take starting right now?
That's a great question. Difficult to answer briefly, but I'll do my best. So a couple of ideas. One is, the one thing that I would propose we all do is start imagining the post-pandemic future. Think about what will the world look like or with the best resources, and if possible with tools of foresight analysis or some sort of tools of futures thinking, and work backwards from there and imagine what we need to do now to shape that future. And by the way, this is a little plug. Open World Rights, which is a relatively well-known portal in the human rights movement, in which Kathryn published the blog version of her piece on rights and responsibilities in the coronavirus setting, is running a blog series just on that, asking human rights practitioners and researchers to write about what we need to do now to prepare for the future. So submissions are welcome, and that I would leave it at that in the interest of time, but that I think is crucial at this moment.
Well, first, I don't think it's possible to say there's one thing that we should all do, but I do think that like one important proposal that's come out of this is the free the vaccine one. And I would just like everyone who leaves this group to keep the free the vaccine in their mind. And when they're talking to people, they mention that as something, we all know that until we have a vaccine, everyone is going to need to get this and mainly survive this. But once we get the vaccine, the crucial issue was going to be how quickly we can deliver this vaccine. So that's an essential pass towards the future. And I think the Free the Vaccine movement is a way of raising consciousness about that next step. I want to end on a note which is a little maybe jarring for people, but one thing I say in the book, this is pre-pandemic, is that 10% of the most wealthy people in the world were producing 50% of global emissions, okay? And that those 10% of the most wealthy people in the world, and by the way, that's not those wealthy businessmen in New York City, that includes myself and many of those colleagues. You don't need that, you don't need so many assets to be 10% of the wealthiest people in the world, okay? So it was a plea to saying the privileged people of the world have to start thinking seriously about the contributions that they are making to climate emissions and rethink the way we live. I would never have wanted this rethinking to have to happen via the coronavirus, but the coronavirus has also is forcing all of us to rethink about how we live. And in some ways, the intense craziness for privileged people of pre-pandemic life. And that is a notion that you just wildly fly all over the world. My colleague going to a one-day climate change seminar in Singapore, you're right? Like what, just crazy stuff. And whether we can have a post-pandemic world where we really question the values of that privileged class that were in some ways connected to the outbreak of the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, César, and everyone, the organizers and everyone for joining us. And I think in response to the question about roles, I agree with what both of you have said. I think we all play different roles to advance change and in moments of crisis. And it's actually critical to have all those roles playing out, and the roles and tactics that we use also need to change and evolve with time. So even all the wonderful lessons that you've shared today will equally evolve with time. So just important to think about roles not as something static or uniform. But yeah, thank you both so much. It's always so wonderful and inspiring to hear both of you speak. And thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. Stay safe, hopeful, forward-looking, and think about your responsibilities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gulika. Bye.
Bye, Gulika.
Thank you.
Bye.